name is Leah. I'm a bookseller at Politics and Prose, and I have the honor of being your host today. Thank you so much for joining us and tuning in this virtual format, which allows us to continue to bring these awesome authors and their important books to readers like you. I am so excited to welcome our very special guest today, Leda Judge, as we celebrate the release of her newest book, The Wisdom of Trees. Look how beautiful this is. If you haven't grabbed a copy already, you can click on the link that will drop in the chat box to get your own copy of Leda's new book, Wisdom of Trees, as well as check out her other amazing titles. Also, if you have a question for our guest today, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and add one there. At the end of our chat, Lita will have some time to answer some of your questions, and you can also vote on the questions you really like and want answered by clicking on the thumbs up button. As always, please remember that this is a creative, safe space, and we ask that friends be respectful of one another in their questions and comments. Also, teachers, if you're sharing your screen today, please include the first name, grade, and school of your student questions so we can give them the proper shout outs. Thanks again, friends, for joining us today and supporting such awesome books. Now on to the event you're all waiting for. It is my honor to introduce the amazingly talented author and illustrator, Leda Judge. Lita has written and illustrated over 20 fiction and nonfiction books, including several award-winning picture books like The Red Sled, When You Need Wings, How Big Were the Dinosaurs, Hoot and Peep, and Flight School, which was even adapted into an off-Broadway musical. Many of Lita's books beautifully portray the wonders of the natural world, from her flourishing brushstrokes to her lyrical writing. Before she wrote books and shared her art, Lita was a geologist and worked on dinosaur digs. And today, we celebrate her newest book, The Wisdom of Trees, how trees work together to form a natural kingdom. Combining lush illustrations and poetry with science, the book paints a vital picture for readers to understand the importance and interconnectedness of trees and the world around us. So, without further ado, let's welcome together Leda Judge. The virtual stage is yours.
Thanks, Leah. It's my honor to be here. It's actually really exciting to have my launch at Politics and Prose. I visited the store before my first book came out, and it stands out among bookstores. So this is a real treat for me. It's also really fun to have a virtual event, and I miss having my hometown and meeting with people and readers. But I know that I have a lot of friends from all across the country joining us this morning, and I thank everybody for tuning in and making this day be special. I'm looking forward to sharing my process and more about the book, and I'm going to slip over to a slideshow so that I can do that, and then again we'll go back to the sharing questions and afterwards. And so my husband is switching over to the slideshow right now. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. There's no indication you're sharing the screen. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the wisdom of trees and how I came to write this book. I know that we have a lot of kids joining us today, and so I'm going to share a little bit about my process of writing and illustrating and how I became a writer, because I know I have a lot of young readers in the audience and hopefully some young creatives in the audience, hopefully people who are dreaming of becoming writers and illustrators someday. How do I hit click? Okay, so this has been a lifelong journey to write this book. I treasure the time. It took me about 4 or 5 years to work on this book. I did a lot of traveling. I did a lot of research. I visited a lot of trees. And so this is a culmination of a really big passion project for me. The book starts out with a poem called A Secret Kingdom. I am a single beech, but I am not alone. Together with my fellow trees, we form a secret kingdom. And the book is structured so that there are poems and illustrations on the left side of the page. And then on the right side, there's an explanation of what's going on in that poem. And this poem, talking about the fact that trees belong to the secret kingdom, introduces the idea that trees are actually a vast community, that scientists are learning to think of trees not as individuals, but as these superorganisms working together. And this is a concept that is really fascinating, because though we have been studying trees for centuries, we have only in the last couple of decades come to understand that trees function together as these superorganisms, working to feed each other, working to help raise their offspring, helping each other fight attack from disease and insects. And the mystery of how this all unfurled was the discovery that under the surface of the earth, the roots have a thing called mycorrhizal fungi attached to the root system. And through this fungi, it becomes like this network connecting the forest. I'm going to read the poem that discusses this concept. It's called How to Speak in Tree. Have you learned to speak in tree? It's very simple, like saying hi. First, find yourself a fungal partner, but feed him well or he won't help. Grow together, sharing all until your fungi reaches others. Talk of food, talk of drought, talk of danger and disease, becoming bigger than just one tree, something more, something we. So this concept that trees are connected through mycorrhizal fungi is just kind of changed our definition of what a tree is, because we realize they're sending out messages, electrical signals to each other and receiving these messages, which means they have a form of language. It's silent, it's not like our language, but it is a language where a tree can say, I'm suffering, I'm hungry, I need help, and other trees can respond. When I read this information, I was blown away by it and wanted to write this book. And before I share more of the book, I'm going to go back and talk about how I came to write this book. And again, I know there's young readers in the audience, and I want to speak to how I get an idea, how I pursue that idea, because whenever I share a book, my goal is to not only share the book, but I really want to encourage our future generation of writers and artists. And so this book started for me many years ago. I was working as a geologist, and then I did some painting where I was painting pieces in galleries, fine art, but I wasn't writing stories. And I felt like there was something missing in my life. I had grown up loving stories, but I was not a published author. I had been writing in my journal, and I was working on a job that I really didn't care for. It had kind of burnt me out. And I had gone on a vacation with my husband. It was a hiking trip through the backcountry of England. And on this trip, I met this amazing common oak in the Cotswolds of England. And this oak tree, we estimate to be about 12 to 1500 years old. And on that particular day, it was pouring rain, and it was in November. It was very cold. And my husband and I took a rest under this giant tree, and we were leaned up against the trunk. And I felt that I needed a change in my life. I felt like I needed to pursue writing and illustrating for children, that the only thing that had been holding me back was fear. I had a comfortable job. I had a steady income, but I didn't have a job that I felt passionately about. And as I rested against this tree, I just kind of gathered the courage, and I promised myself when I went home, I was going to write my first children's book. This was many years ago, and I did. I went home and I started writing the first day I got back, and I ended up showing that book, that story that I wrote, to a publisher. It didn't get published, but it got me a conversation with an editor who gave me a book to illustrate. And then while I was illustrating that book, I wrote another book. And that book did get published. And ever since then, I've been writing and illustrating books. So I have a particular fondness for this tree. And I promised myself if I ever got published, I'd go back and visit it. And so I did that. And then over the years, I promised myself that every fifth book I've published, that I would go and visit this tree. The last time I visited this tree, I began to be worried about whether the tree would still be standing, because there had been so much development in the course of the years that I had been watching this tree. And there had also been a lot of disease hitting the giant oaks in this area because they were stressed due to climate change. And I realized that these trees we rely on them and we think of them as permanent, but they're actually at risk. And I had also been reading the scientific papers about how trees communicate, and I knew I wanted to write this book. This book feels like a passion project for me because growing up in nature has always been a part of my life. I was actually born on an island off the coast of Alaska, and my dad was a soil scientist. And for several years, we didn't live in a house. We lived in a variety of tents and cars and trailers on Forest Service land, and we moved around, and the only thing that was in common was that we were surrounded with nature. And so I grew up feeling a strong connection to the natural world. The house that I thought of as home was actually my grandmother's house that we visited every summer. And that wasn't actually a really normal house either. My grandparents lived in this ancient house that they had found abandoned in the 1930s in the middle of the Buena Vista Marsh. And at the time it had no electricity. They eventually put electricity in, but it had no running water. We had a pump where we got our water. It had an outhouse, and the house itself was filled with birds of prey because my grandparents were ornithologists, and my grandmother took care of golden eagles. We got to raise baby owlets, and I grew up loving nature because I was surrounded with the natural world. I was surrounded by the birds, and I spent every day working on the marsh with my grandparents to ban hawks and learn about the wildlife around me. While I was working to learn about the wildlife, I carried a journal with me. And if you had asked me as a kid if I was going to be a writer or an artist, I would have said no, because I struggled to learn to read. I learned later that I was dyslexic. I struggled to learn to write. It was a real challenge, partly because I was growing up in a part of the country where I didn't have a lot of exposure to books, but also because I was being taught how to read in a world of verbal learners. And I realize now I'm a very visual learner. One of the things that really taught me was to write in a journal. My journal was my safe place. It was a creative place. So even though if I was assigned to write in school, I would be incredibly nervous and panic and worried about whether people would like it. I was a terrible speller. I didn't think of myself as a writer. But I know now I've always been a writer because from the age of 4, I carried a journal with me. I wrote about the things that I had observed. I drew pictures of what I saw. Somehow drawing pictures gave me confidence because that was something that came much more naturally to me. And the journal really taught me how to write because it taught me the most important things I needed to be a writer. If you want to be a writer or an artist, the number one thing you need is to be a great observer. And this journal taught me how to be an observer because I would see the world around me and then record it. The second most important thing you need is just to have a great big imagination. And by having a journal, I could capture the things I saw. I actually call my journal my memory palace because I capture the things I saw. And if you write or draw something in your journal, I guarantee you, years later, you're going to remember that in a way that is so different than if you just saw it and didn't spend the time recording it. So my journals are my memory palace. They're the place where my imagination grows, where it's the seeds of what I'm seeing turn into stories. And I'm going to share a little bit about how I use that process to be a writer. But when I was a kid, I never imagined I'd get to be a writer. I actually thought I was going to be a scientist because my grandparents were scientists. My parents had studied science. My dad was a soil scientist. All their friends were scientists. I just thought that's what you did when you grew up. And when I was a kid, I loved dinosaurs. I was fascinated with them. I decided I was going to be a paleontologist. By the time I was 14, I was so excited about this journey in life that I wrote tons of letters asking if I could be a paleontologist, asking museums if I could volunteer on a dig. And eventually I found a museum that let me work on a dig. I was 15, I went up to Canada, worked for the Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology, and I got to pull some pretty amazing fossils out of the ground. And I got to work in the museum. It was exciting because the museum was just opening. And I went to school to be a geologist. I worked as a geologist, but I actually had a great big secret, which is I really wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be an illustrator. I wanted to spend my life studying things I felt passionately about and then writing about them for young children. And so it took me a while to get the confidence, but I realized if I wrote about things I loved, that it would make it much easier. And I realized I'd been carrying that journal around for all these years and that I had a ton of material to work with because I had volunteered at a wildlife safari where we took care of endangered animals. And I had grown up watching animals in the wild and studied behavior. And I just started writing books that just kind of grew out of my life. So I've written a lot of nonfiction books about animal behavior. I've also written a lot of fictional books because that journal carried my imagination and built stories out of that. And so all of my stories start with something personal in my life. That's where I get my ideas. I draw from my experiences. Now I live in New Hampshire, and I'm really fortunate because I live out in the woods where I'm surrounded by nature, which I find is my constant inspiration. This is my interior of my studio, and this is the window where I do all my work. And just share briefly, these are all pictures I took while I was working, just looking out the window. This is all happening 2 or 3 feet from my desk. I live in this magical place where sometimes the turkeys come through. This is a little fawn that was born in the ferns right outside my window that I got to watch grow up. This is a pair of fox that den on our land, and they come through and snitch bird seed from the bird feeder. This is a bear who, if I forget to take the feeders in at night, he's always quick to empty the feeders out, and sometimes he visits during the day, but we love having bears walk through our land. This is a bobcat that I see on a regular basis in the winter. We don't see him much in the summer, but every winter he suns himself on the south side of my studio. And this picture is, he's literally standing a couple of feet away from me. And I count on these things for my inspiration, but I also still count on my journals. Every time I travel and leave the house, I carry 6, 7 journals with me. These are all journals from one trip, and they eventually inspired my book, Hoot and Peep. But I really encourage those of you in the audience who want to be writers or artists, work in your journal. This is where we get our ideas. This is where we get to practice. It's where we build our imaginations. And I did that for this book. Once I knew I wanted to write the story about the wisdom of trees, I went back to the tree that had started the whole journey for me. I sat there and I drew at its base, and I traveled around. I traveled to visit a lot of ancient forests, which meant I got to travel abroad as well as through America. You know, unfortunately here in America, much of our native timbers have been cut. I was actually born in Alaska in the national forest, and we lived under the giant Douglas fir. And though the trees are enormous and there are still small pockets of old growth tree, we don't see how incredibly majestic these trees used to grow. They used to be 400 feet old, 400 feet tall and several centuries old, but all of our trees have been logged. And so to visit really ancient forests, I had to go to Europe. This is Dinforth Forest in Wales, where it's one of the oldest tree preserves in the world. I did visit the bristlecone pines in the Southwest, and some of those trees are 4,000 years old. So it was an amazing experience to research these trees. And like all my books, I carried my journal and I recorded what I was seeing. And I really want to emphasize that a journal isn't just for illustrators to record what you're seeing. It's also a place for you to gather your thoughts. And one of the things that taught me how to write was to trust my process. A lot of writers start with writing and they start with researching the written word. For me, I start in the visual world. I go out and I record what I see. And in that process, when you're drawing a picture, you're describing the thing that you're about to write about. So you're learning about it, you're observing, and you're doing your research. So I always start visually, because once I start then turning to words, I have a ton of ideas, and I find that the journal has propelled me into the story. Here I'm sitting in the heart of an ancient yew tree. It's 4,000 years old. When I went to go find it, it was a journey to find it, first of all, because we knew on the map where it was, but it's a very rural remote part of Wales. And we were bumbling through the back countryside, and eventually we stumbled to where we thought this tree was. But it was amazing because the tree is so old, it's estimated to be 4,000 years old. And with yews, the interior of the yew will rot, but the exterior remains alive. And so you're like stepping into what feels like the heart of maybe 4 or 5 yew trees. And then you realize you're in the heart of this giant ancient tree. So I'm sitting right inside this amazing yew tree, and I'm sketching and I'm gathering my thoughts to write this book. Once I go back into the studio, I still work in a visual world for a long time before I work in the written word. I work at a storyboard. Sometimes on the computer, I have a storyboard. You can see here, I also have a lot of help when I'm working. And And sometimes I work at a bulletin board. And this is what a storyboard looks like for me. This is a different book, but you can see how I have visually structured the story so that when I go to write the story, I know visually where that story is going. And I encourage those kids out there who are visual learners, allow yourself to work in a way that brings out your strengths. We always talk about writing only in terms of words. And I think if you allow yourself to see your books and allow yourself to explore the revision and the journey of what the story is going to tell you in a visual place, that you can be a creator of stories. Even if you are like me, more visual, you can work in a written form eventually, because you're building that structure of the story in a place that's comfortable for you. So when I work on a story, I do tons of research and I'm learning all I can, but I'm also drawing. If I'm going to write about trees, I need to understand them completely. And I do a lot of literally thousands of sketches. This is just a really rough sketch. It didn't actually make it into the book, but I learned from that experience of drawing this sketch. And so everything eventually goes into that book. Then I start thinking about the structure of the book. In the case of this story, I mentioned how there are poems and then there are sidebars giving more information. And so this is a sketch where I'm thinking about the structure of the book and how it's going to look. Here's another one. This is a spread that's going to introduce the concept that the trees feed a forest and that the wildlife and depends on the forest, and the habitat that forests provide is we have to have the habitat in order to have healthy forests and also healthy ecosystems for ourselves and for wildlife. And so I'm filling out the sketch. And then I have to start thinking about color, because if I'm going to paint a book, it's not obvious how the color will go. A lot of people think, well, the sky's blue and the trees are green. Isn't that how you're going to paint it? But if you think about it, the forest in the morning looks different than the forest in the evening, and it all creates a different mood. And so I start doing color studies, and that eventually allows me to understand how this whole book is going to come together. While I'm working in those sketches and the coloring, I'm writing poems at the same time, I'm revising the words, and eventually all the pieces come together to tell this story about how the forest feeds the wildlife that lives within the forest itself. So every spread of a book, every painting I've ever painted for a book starts with color studies. Some of them are done on location out in the woods. Some are done in my studio based on my sketchbooks, but every single page starts that way. And then I do small paintings that become studies for the larger paintings. And then I sometimes change my mind and I realize that the original color study doesn't capture what I wanted to say. I have to change it. I know there's a lot of young writers out there. When I was a kid, I thought I wasn't a good writer because I thought that when I read a book that somebody else had written, I thought they just sat down and wrote that book. And as I got older, I realized I'm actually a good writer. It just takes time to write a book. This story took me 4 to 5 years to write and work on the illustrations. It's a long journey, and all of my books take an average of 3 to 6 years. So I encourage you guys, give yourself time to really get to know this subject. Something like this book, where we get to talk about how trees change our climate, how our planet relies on them to clean our air. It deserves our time and attention over the long part. I'm going to go back and read a couple of the poems and talk about the book itself, now that you know how I came to write it. This one is one of my favorite poems in the book. It's called "We Are Like Wizards." Below our canopy of branches, summer heat gives way to shade. Come wild windblown seed and creeping vine, come mushroom, moss, and orchid. Plant yourself in the rich, moist soil our decaying leaves provide. Come tiny mouse and long-legged monkey, come snake, parrot, and jaguar. You are welcome to share the climate we create. We clean the air and seed the clouds. We drench the thirsty land with rain. We are like wizards. And the sidebar goes on to explain how the trees help us control our climate. They create a climate. They trap moisture in the ground, and they keep our planet from becoming a desert. In the Southwest, we logged the pine forests that lived there centuries ago, and now we think of the Southwest as being a desert, but it didn't used to be like that. It used to be forested. When we cut down trees, we change the climate, and we need to plant our forests and keep our forests healthy, because they're our best defense against global warming and for keeping our quality of air clean. This is another poem that I love called Song of Hunger. The sounds you hear are the melodies of birds and wind and rattling limbs. But there is another song of the forest. It is a song only my fellow trees will hear. And this talks about that silent communication trees are doing under their roots, that they're talking to each other. And if a tree has been damaged by a storm or maybe affected by drought and it's hungry, it will send out signals to its neighboring trees, and they will send sugars from their own bodies to feed this tree. And this goes beyond species. A birch tree will feed a fir tree if it's in need. There's so much to learn from trees about how a community can help each other and how the health of the community depends on every individual. So this is one of the, I think maybe my favorite thing that I learned in writing this book. One of the things I love about being an author is that you always get to be a learner. You always get to be a student. I love learning new things, and you feel like you're an explorer. You're learning about the world around you. This is another poem I enjoy. Neighbor, can you hear me? Neighbor, can you hear me? There are insects on my leaves. I can taste their saliva as they nibble, nibble, nibble. Neighbor, can you hear me? Together we must act. Call the deadly wasps to help us fight them back. So this talks about how trees actually will send out signals when they're being attacked by caterpillars. They'll say help to their neighbors, and the neighbors will produce these pheromones or chemicals that they release into the wind, and they put toxins like tannins into their leaves that make them bitter, and it will make the insects go off to another forest, and then that forest has to send out alert signals, and it will save the tree who's being attacked. This is amazing. I mean, this book was so fun to write because I just learned so many cool facts about forests. This is one last, and this is inspired by the yew tree that I visited, the one that I was sitting in the heart of. This is another yew tree that was in another part of Wales, but I actually did actually, this one's in London. I actually did a trail. I scouted out all these ancient yews that are alive in England. And it was a treasure hunt of discovering these old bodies of yews. This is called We Are the Ancient. For hundreds of years, we have taken our turn to block the wind and help our fellow trees. We have survived drought, disease, and blizzard storms. Now it's time to rest. And it talks about how when an old tree is too ancient to feed itself, the neighbors will kick in and start feeding it. I'm going to move on. We're nearly out of time, and I just want to talk a little bit about what I'm working on next. I have another book coming out in a month, and I love as a writer, and I want to encourage you young readers out there. For me, it's really fun to not get stuck in a rut and do the same kind of stories. I kind of go back and forth between fiction and nonfiction because nonfiction teaches me so much about the world around me. The research and the things I learn, but fiction teaches me a lot about myself and things that I'm thinking about. And this book is coming out next month. It's called Even the Smallest Will Grow. I'm really excited about this book. It's about a little girl who's discovering the world around her, but she's feeling very small and tiny compared to the world. And she slips into a dream world. And in the dream, she's thinking about all the things that she could become. It starts with patience, little one, there is strength in even the smallest things. A tadpole waits for the tiny buds to lengthen into legs. And it just is a discovery of the world around her. It's a whimsical story. It's a story inspired by a kitten that I adopted a couple of years ago. And just briefly, because we were celebrating trees today, but I just wanted to give a little sneak peek of a book that's coming down my way. I love creating these books. I love sharing them with young readers. And I hope that they inspire you as creators to write and draw pictures and read books and discover the world around you. I'm going to slip back to the not slides so that we can share questions and question time. I think, can everybody see me now? Great. Hi, Leah.
Hi, thank you so much. That was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your beautiful art and your words. I think we're going to move on to some questions. I see some great questions in the chat. So are you ready to share some more wisdom
Absolutely.
And answer questions?
Yes.
And there's still time to add more questions if you have some. But our first question comes from Jackson. And Jackson asks, what is your favorite type of tree?
What is my favorite tree? Oh, Jackson. You know, I love aspens, I think, the most because, first of all, I don't know if you've seen them. I don't know where you live, but aspens, they're called quaking aspens because their leaves flutter in the wind. And in the fall, they turn bright yellow. And you walk into the grove of aspen trees, their birches, their trunks are bright white and their leaves are bright yellow, and you can't not be happy. But what's amazing is when you walk into a grove of aspen, a forest, you're actually walking into the heart of one tree. Under the ground, they're all connected, and aspen actually clone each other. And one of the oldest trees on the planet is a 10,000-year-old aspen tree that looks like a forest, but it's all a clone of one tree. So they're pretty amazing. What kind of individual can make a whole forest with its own body? So that has to be my favorite tree.
That is so cool. I love that. Thank you. Our next question comes from Charlene. Charlene asks, when writing one book on a particular topic, do you often get inspired to write another on another topic? In other words, does one book lead to another?
I'm so glad you asked that, Charlene. And that's why one of the reasons I wanted to share Even the Smallest, and I didn't articulate that, but yes, you're absolutely right. I feel like my books are like a path to each. They're like stepping stones. Each one starts with the one before and goes to the one after. So the book I wrote before The Wisdom of Trees was called When You Need Wings. And it was about a little girl coping with anxiety. And she steps into her imagination. And if you remember, if any of you have seen this book, it's set in a forest, right? She walks into the forest because that's her safe place. And when I finished that book, I realized I needed to honor the forest that was my safe place. So I wrote the book about trees. And then I shared with you Even the Smallest, which was my next book. And you can see it's inspired by nature, right? The little girl is thinking about all the wonderful things that are going to happen to her in her life and all the things that she can become, but it's rooted in nature, right? So the trees led to that book. And then the next book that I'm working on is kind of, if you notice in one of the slides, there was a giraffe in Even the Smallest, right? So the next book, the main character in the story was inspired by a character in this book. So I love my books to connect and weave together. My body of work definitely is a trail of ideas that are connected.
Oh yeah, I love, like, you have your little giraffe in here too. All
Yeah,
friends you
that's
have
right.
there, you can find your little giraffe. So I'm so excited for that one too. Thank you. Well, our next one comes from Ryan. Ryan asks, thanks for sharing your words and wisdom. My question is, which comes first for you, words or images?
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for asking that, because I can't emphasize enough. When I was taught in school to write a story, I was taught to put words down on a paper. And honestly, I broke out in a sweat. I felt so insecure. I was a smart student, to be honest. I was a very good student, but I was terrified. It was always ended in tears when I had to start writing with words. And it wasn't until I became an adult that I realized I can start a story any way I need to start a story or want to. And I always start with pictures. I've written 30 books so far. My 30th one just got accepted. And only one story in all of those stories started with words first. And I did it just to push myself. And then I went back to the way that works with me. So for all of you visual learners out there, the artists, you can love stories as much as me and want to be a writer, even though writing may not come naturally to you, but that's okay, because there's this other way that we can create, which is visually, and then the words will come easier. And for those of you who are verbal word learners and the words come first, that is a great way. To be honest, most of my friends write stories that way. So obviously that works too. Whatever works for you.
Love that. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's so true. We all have different ways to kind of express these amazing ideas. Our next question comes from Allie or Ollie. This is such a beautiful book, you say. Did writing and illustrating it change your personal experience of the natural world? And if so, how?
Thank you, Allie. You know, it did. Even though I've grown up living in nature, and even though I have spent a lifetime living in the forest and the woods, it did change my perspective. And I think the biggest way it changed my perspective is because I was always focused on what was happening above ground and always what I could see. And I realized that so much of what was actually happening, which is happening in a forest, is below ground. More life is happening below ground than above ground. And so it really changed my perspective, because it really made me realize like how we have to always push ourselves to learn, that we walk through life thinking we're observant, and then there's always something more to observe. There's always more understanding. And I think that's true with the world and how we interact as human beings. There's always something to learn about our fellow human beings and how we can learn to get along and how we can learn to help this planet. And I realized, like, no matter what you think you've done to open up your perspective, there's always more that we can do to learn a more expanded perspective. And so I'm really thankful for writing this book, because it taught me to go deeper and to look past what I can just observe. So yes, that was a great question, Allie. Thank you.
That was such a great question and such a great answer. Thank you. So true. Our next question comes from Daisy. Daisy asks, what similarities are there between being a scientist and being a writer illustrator?
Oh, Daisy, you guys are great. I'm loving these questions. Thank you so much. You know, when I went from being a geologist to an artist, I was actually really nervous to tell my geology professor, the professor who was a big influence on my life, because I thought, what are they going to think that I've decided to be an artist instead? And they were so cool about it, because they realized, like, well, art is observation and science is observation. And I always tell kids there's a lot of science in art and there's a lot of art in science. And what I mean is, to be a great scientist, you have to be a great observer. You have to learn to see the world, kind of like what I was saying before, like you think you're seeing the world, but actually there's so much going on below the surface of the earth. You have to learn to like see deeper and ask yourself questions of what am I not understanding? And art is the same thing. When I used to think I wasn't good at writing when I was a kid, it's because I didn't understand what a long journey writing a story is. It's not a matter of sitting down with an idea and writing a book from start to finish. It's a matter of having an idea and then asking yourself questions about that idea and challenging that idea and thinking about how you can improve it and what happens next. And so the process of good science is the same as the process of good art. And they both require observation and imagination. So they're really actually deeply connected. I didn't get to go to art school, and I've never had an art class in school, because I lived in a really remote areas that didn't have art classes. And I realized I actually had the best training I could have hoped for, because I trained to be a scientist, and I worked as with my grandparents who were biologists. I worked out in nature, observing every day, and it trained me to be both a scientist and then become an artist.
Oh, thank you so much, because it's so true. All the question we ask and our observations, they go hand in hand. And a lot of these, you're just showing so many different outlets to look at the subject matter. So thank you so much. Let's take another question. Our next one is from Violet. And Violet asks, what is the rarest tree you saw in Europe?
What is the rarest tree? Oh, that's a really good question. I haven't thought about that. I know I was really excited to see a chestnut tree because they've been so affected by fungal disease that they used to be one of the most prevalent trees. In fact, I read in New England that half of the trees in New England used to be chestnut trees. And then I think it was around 1910, this horrible fungus swept through and killed almost every single tree. And that's true in Europe too. But they are surviving. They are from the stumps of these ancient trees, new shoots are growing, and then they die because of the fungus, and they grow again, and then they die again. But over the centuries, they are learning to adapt to this fungus, and they're learning to grow. And so I guess maybe that is a rare tree, because it's a tree that almost went extinct, and yet it's surviving. The American elm is another example of that. That was wiped out nearly from a fungus, and it is starting to make a comeback very, very slowly. It takes centuries. You know, we always measure things by our lifetime, but trees have a very different lifetime. So centuries sometimes to bring these ancient trees back.
Wow, that's just so amazing. And it really shows their resilience too. It's something.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's such an impact when we cut them down, just how long they've been around. It really makes you
absolutely
think.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Elizabeth, and Elizabeth asks, did anyone help you make the book?
Oh, did anyone help me make the book? Yes. First of all, the scientists who are doing the research. I mean, as a writer, I'm humbled by the people who are actually on the ground, forest ecologists who are discovering that these trees are communicating through their mycorrhizal fungi. This is something we can't see, and yet these scientists are doing amazing work to discover how this is happening. So kudos to all of them. Another person I want to mention is my husband, because he used to be an engineer, and I got this idea. I wanted to be a writer and an illustrator, and quickly became so incredibly busy following this passion that he quit his job as an engineer so that he can travel around and do research with me. And he plans my school visits. I do lots of school visits, and he vets my books, which means I do tons and tons of research, and I write them, and then I make him check everything again to just make sure everything is right. He like is always looking for mistakes. He does my website. There's a lovely video on my website, which I hope some of you kids might visit, about how I made this book, and it has some other information in it. And my husband put that together. He films it and edits it. So, you know, we are a partnership. My name is on the book, and I do the writing and illustrating, but he does so much of the work behind what goes into bringing these books into the world and sharing them with kids.
Love that. Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Nolan. Nolan asks, where do you live and where is that woods? I would love to live there. It would give me tons of inspiration. So you said a lot of friends that came to visit you while you're working, but do you go out in the woods, and what kind of stuff do you see go out to?
Yeah, I'm really lucky. I live in the southwest corner of New Hampshire, a little town called Peterborough, and we live out in the woods. And Nolan, it's such a really lovely place because we don't see any houses, we don't see any lights. I'm surrounded with hardwoods and pine, and every day I see turkeys and bobcat and bear and fox. And I walk into the woods. I try to walk every day. In January in New Hampshire, it's pretty chilly. I don't know where you are, Nolan, but it can get pretty cold, but I really feel connected to the earth and connected to the world. And so I really try, no matter what the weather, to get out on a daily basis. And I carry my journal a lot of the time. Sometimes I just sit and think about whatever story I'm working on. And I find that when I'm working at the easel, it's a time to actually be working, but when I'm in nature, it's a time to be thinking, to probably be problem solving. And so I'm really fortunate to live in a place that is so inspirational to me. And a lot of my stories that I'm working on are inspired by my childhood, but just as many of them are inspired by my day-to-day existence here in New Hampshire. And I don't think I could live anywhere else, because I've built this home from scratch, so that every time you look out the window, you're seeing a view of the woods that I'm surrounded by, and feel very, very fortunate to live here.
Well, it's kind of connected to our next question. Grant asks, would you prefer to live anywhere else? So if you were going to live anywhere else, where would you want to live? Because it sounds like you've had so many amazing travels.
Yeah, Grant, I have a secret. If I could live anywhere, I would live in Cotswold, England. I love England. Whenever I can, I slip away. And I think I love the history in England and Europe in general. I love all of Europe. Besides being fascinated with nature, I'm also fascinated with history, and some of my books have covered that. And here in America, we have a rich history, but there it's so much longer. It's just so the legacy. And also one of the reasons I'm a children's book illustrator is because when I was about maybe 12, I was fairly old. I didn't have a lot of exposure to children's books when I was a kid, but I found a copy of a Beatrix Potter book in the attic of my grandmother's house. And Beatrix Potter was this amazing woman that lived in the turn of the century, 1900s. And she was one of the first children's books writers and illustrators. And she was phenomenally successful. And in a time when very few women had careers. And she turned her fortune that she made off of children's books to conserving the land and protecting endangered old breeds of livestock and protecting endangered pieces of land from getting developed. And one of my first trips to Europe was to visit her homestead. And I felt such a huge connection to her existence that became a wellspring for me. So I often go there. And this is where that tree that I mentioned, the one that I visited that started it all, this is where that tree lives as well. So yeah, I feel, I guess I always feel like my heart part of my heart lives there as well. But I really do love New Hampshire, and I wouldn't give up living here.
Oh, thank you everyone for so many amazing questions. I think we only have time for one more. So our last question is gonna be from Elliot, and Elliot asks, what's your favorite book? Are there any books I'll further that have really inspired you as well?
You know, I get asked that a lot, and I'm not trying to be difficult. It's so hard to answer because I hope that you saw through my process, right? I worked on the tree book for like 4 or 5 years, and all of my books grow that way. I work on the fastest I've ever created a book was in 3 years. And I choose things from my own life. So, you know, the tree book, that represents a lifetime of nature, but my book Flight School, about the little penguin, that's kind of a self-portrait about a little girl who was born in a very remote part of the world, who had this big dream of becoming a writer and an illustrator, and first a paleontologist and then a writer and illustrator. And that book's about like fulfilling your dream no matter what the obstacles you face. The book that I shared with you that's coming out next month, that was inspired by my kitten, and it was kind of inspired during a time in my life when I was feeling really burnt out. But her joy and discovery of the world was so magical. You know, I've written a book about my grandmother. I've written a book about my parrot. Everything I write about is so connected to my life. And I hope you guys as creators draw from your life. You know, when I felt intimidated to write a story, often it was because I was asked to write something that I didn't feel a connection to. But take time in your life to write about something you feel deeply connected to. That's where you're going to get your creative juices flowing. And that's where you're going to get your inspiration and your confidence as a writer. So I'm sorry that we don't have time. I see there's a lot of questions. If any of you out there are dying to ask your questions, please visit my website and send me an email, because I regret that I can't answer everybody's questions in our time together.
Now, we've had so many great questions. Thank you so much for all your contributions. I have one last question for you, for me too, is that you've spoken so much about how important trees are for the world around us, and how much they've done for you, for us. Do you have any recommendations on things that we can do?
Thank you for asking that question. Yes, there's so many things we can do. It can feel intimidating, overwhelming, can't it? It can feel like we're overburdened to make a difference. And sometimes it feels like, how can we make a difference? But every day that you wake up, you can make choices. You know, an obvious thing is how much paper you use. When as an author, I use a lot of paper. I have to draw a lot of drawings, but I draw a book out on one side of the paper. And then when I'm all done, I save all of that paper and I write the next book on the back side of the paper. Every piece of paper. So my books are like double. But also the choices, like when you buy food, think about the packaging it comes in. Think about how far it traveled, because the resources, we shouldn't just think about the trees. The resources that we are using in the planet cost the planet so much. And if we can have a lower impact on the planet, we can make a huge difference. Think about how much heat you need in your home. You know, can you put a sweater on and turn the thermostat down, because that uses fossil fuels? Think about, do you need to jump in the car to go get a snack or something? You know, this is a time when we can think about being organized in our lives and making fewer trips, because every time we run around on the planet, we're using fossil fuels and we're costing energy. And also think about valuing the woods. If we go out and hike in the woods instead of running to some other kind of entertainment, if we grow up learning about the woods, we will treasure it and we will protect it, and we will value the next time somebody is developing a piece of land. We'll think twice about whether we need that development, or what are we losing when we constantly think about what we want. We think too much in this culture about what we want, and we don't think about what we're using in order to make that. And in your own homes, plant a tree. Plant lots of trees. And also, I want to say, don't cut the snags down. I know with my neighbors, they hate the fact that I actually make snags. I will preserve trees and leave the dead trees, because the dead trees provide so much food and homes for critters, and they need these trees. And people cut them down because they think they're unsightly, but they're beautiful. They're condos for wildlife. The squirrels, the raccoons, the possums, they all live in there and they rely on them. And the woodpeckers find their food there. Tons of animals find their food. So think about in your neighborhood, when you see a dead tree, encourage the people who have that dead tree, don't cut it down. don't think about the visual aspect of it. If you value it for the wildlife that live in there, I guarantee you're going to start looking at that snag in a whole different way, and it's going to be a beautiful treasure to behold.
Thank you so much. Those are such great words. Thank you for leaving us with those thoughts. That's all the time we have for all those great questions. Thank you all so much for your contributions again. And big thanks to Lita for joining us this morning and sharing your words, your art, and your insights. And of course, thank you all viewers for joining us today. Don't forget, you can still click on the link in our chat box to get your own copy of The Wisdom of Trees or pre-order her new beautiful one she just mentioned or her other amazing books. And also to find out about more events, check out our website for updated listings. You can follow our Kids and Teen department on social media. We'll drop that handle in the chat as well. And you can also watch our past events, and also this one will be posted on our YouTube page as well. So thanks again, everyone. Keep reading widely, expanding your world, and exploring new ones, and even those in your backyard. Maybe I'm ready to take a nature walk right now. So stay safe, and thanks again.
Thank you.